Picture this. You're starting a new One Piece arc for the first time. The Straw Hats are sailing and goofing around, the larger world is getting a lot of interesting development, and then you get to the new island. It's a breathtaking place with colorful characters and geographical quirks. You follow the crew as they explore that setting and uncover the deep history behind its veil of wonder. Flash forward about 50 episodes or 40 chapters and you can't wait to get as far away as possible from that new island and its inhabitants. You feel relieved when the Thousand Sunny hits the ocean and you get excited for what's to come all over again. No matter how much you love One Piece, I'm sure you've experienced this phenomenon at least once during your journey to catch up. Why is that? Well, I think that part of it is simply burnout. One Piece as a whole is really long and its story arcs are also really long. If you watch or read anything for long enough, you're bound to get at least a little bit tired of it, no matter how good it is. Now, maybe that doesn't apply to you at all. Maybe you've enjoyed One Piece non-stop throughout every single episode or chapter, although I've found that's a pretty rare occurrence within the community. I myself am someone who will defend even Long Ring Long Land for existing, and yet at some point or another, I too fall victim to this One Piece fatigue. Is it really just the fact that it's super long and occasionally suffers from pacing issues? I think not. I think that there's another reason for this experience. One Piece isn't too long, it just has too much. Oda doesn't know how to say no to himself. It's like he throws in as much as he possibly can into every arc. Main characters, side characters, animals, geography, B-plots, even transportation methods. Most of the time, this sort of thing is great and you may actually find yourself craving more. Other times, you won't even remember half of the stuff you saw outside of the main plot. There are even instances where this approach can outright tarnish the effectiveness of the storytelling. This compulsion to show as much as possible is One Piece's biggest weakness. However, I would also argue for it being its greatest strength, a double-edged sword. Today, I'm going to be looking at both sides of this issue, as well as exploring how it could be changed to be something that is all strength and no weakness. By the way, there will be spoilers if you're not finished with Wano. When talking about this topic, I'm sure there are a few examples that come to mind for you. Obviously, it's all subjective. Different arcs affect different people, well, differently. Still, when it comes to arcs that are too long, there are three that stand out above the rest in my opinion. Dressrosa, Punk Hazard, and Wano, specifically Act 3. The reasons for their length are the same. They're stuffed with a lot of characters and too many plot threads, some of which are arguably completely unnecessary, such as Brownbeard or the Big Mom amnesia subplot. Let's start by talking about how these arcs are negatively impacted by this sort of thing. First off, shonen manga is a medium that is fundamentally designed to be consumed week to week. Every weekend, around 15 pages or so are released until the next one. Personally, I feel like it's a detriment to any story to be consumed in this manner, but there are plenty of manga where one chapter a week can feel like more than enough. It's a tricky balancing act because if you don't give readers enough content, it won't feel like it's worth the wait, and if you try to cram in too much, then it can hurt the moment-to-moment pacing. For the most part, I think Oda handles this balancing act pretty well. He's a master of his craft and, frankly, he doesn't get enough credit for his paneling skills or his ability to carefully allocate page time to exactly who or what may need it. With that said, no matter how good he may be at what he does, not everyone is going to care about an emotional standoff between some guy named Brownbeard and Caesar Clown. Not everyone is going to care about a fight showcasing some lady named Giola and her artistic abilities. Not everyone is going to care about Chopper trying to cure a disease that turns people into ice onis. Some people certainly will, and I myself will be arguing for their inclusion later in the video. However, almost nobody is going to want to see stuff like that more than the main characters directly interacting with the main plot, especially when these side tangents can sometimes be 3 to 4 chapters long. That doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're reading week to week, then that means you'd sometimes have to wait a full 1 to 2 months to get back to something you're really interested in seeing. If you have the luxury of being able to binge, then you definitely won't be as affected. If a chapter's not holding your attention, then you can just skim through it and quickly leave it behind. Though with arcs like Dressrosa that are over 100 chapters long, sometimes powering through all of that leads to even worse burnout. Now, of course, these side tangent chapters, as I like to call them, are rarely exclusively centered around the less interesting content. They usually do have an intention behind them and will often feature other stuff going on as well. Oda also does a great job at using less significant subjects in order to build up to the bigger moments. But when it takes over 10 chapters for Luffy to get to the roof in Onigashima and 3 chapters for him to land his finishing blow on Kaido, it's no wonder why people were begging to get out of Wano by the end. Sure, there's meaningful substance sprinkled throughout those stretches, but it's very sparse and chaotic. Again, I don't think this is merely a pacing problem as many people might say. There's just so much going on and so many characters that are sharing the spotlight that it kills the momentum of other, often more compelling story beats. Even though I've mainly been using examples from Wano, Punk Hazard, and Dressrosa, this is definitely a problem that can be found throughout the majority of One Piece. For example, are the priests of Skypiea really memorable enough to dedicate a significant portion of the arc in order to showcase their fights? Does Absalom really need to exist just for that one gag that everybody hates? For the record, I love all of these arcs, and Wano is actually my favorite out of the whole series. But would Punk Hazard not be more enjoyable if it was only half as long and solely focused on the alliance of Law and Luffy, the capture of Caesar, and the team up with the Marines, rather than a plot to take over the entire island with multiple B-tier fights and a giant slime monster named Smiley? Stories like Zou and Sabaody have proven that short and sweet arcs can be just as, if not more effective when all the extra stuff is trimmed down. So why not take that approach more often? For that, there are 2 explanations that I believe in, one of which I've already mentioned. The first is that Oda seemingly doesn't have it in him to resist his own creative impulses. The second is that One Piece is largely marketed as a battle shonen, which it technically is. Let's talk about that before we get into the former statement. So, just like how the medium is designed to be a 1 chapter per week experience, it's also burdened by certain narrative expectations, the most prominent being that of action and/or major fights. Of course, we all read stories for different reasons, and a large portion of One Piece fans care way more about the lore and emotional aspects than they do the fights. Still, whether you want to admit it or not, battle shonen is what keeps the lights on over at Shueisha. If an arc isn't building up to a big Zoro fight or a crazy display of a villain's power, then unfortunately not as many people are going to tune in. Therefore, there is a legitimate pressure for a mangaka to construct a story arc in a somewhat formulaic way. Fishman Island is a pretty good example. I actually really like Hody Jones as a villain, but it's no secret that he's nowhere near as menacing or threatening as someone like Doflamingo or Kaido. Yes, part of that arc's purpose was to give the Straw Hats an opportunity to flex their post-time skip training. But when you throw in something like the energy steroid pills just to make the fights a little bit more evenly matched, it feels like we're just checking off boxes at that point. Luffy needs to have a big final clash, therefore Hody Jones has to be forced to fit into the mold of a standard shonen antagonist, when that was never what he was in the first place. Then you have Punk Hazard, where Caesar is put in a similar position with underbosses that mostly exist to be opponents for Zoro and Law. These are 2 arcs that could have been much more concise, but instead were extended in order to build up to fights purely for the sake of having a series of final clashes. Whether or not this is Oda's doing or the influence of editors or publishing, I don't know, but it's definitely driven by a desire to meet a particular quota. Now, I love a good One Piece fight. I would probably even be entertained just watching Zoro fight a random gorilla or something. Most of the time, One Piece's action is executed extremely well and manages to add more substance to the story. All I'm saying is that it doesn't need to be there all the time, and there are definitely a handful of instances where it feels a little bit forced. Now let's get back to my other point, which is Eiichiro Oda and his indomitable imagination. Random and unnecessary is his whole MO. I mean, it's essentially one of the biggest reasons for his success. We're talking about the guy whose favorite character is a dude with a green afro that got trapped in a treasure box. Everyone always praises him for his methodical planning and foreshadowing, but people rarely bring up Oda's skillful spontaneity. If there's one thing he can do well, it's create some wildly entertaining ideas on the fly. 9 times out of 10, these will be hilariously wonderful additions to the story, such as a group of kung fu fighting seals or a pinhead who lost his pride and joy. He's even shown that he can take unserious concepts and utilize them in a way that strengthens the plot. I mean, just look at Buggy. The problem isn't necessarily the ideas themselves, it's that to Oda, there's seemingly never enough. I imagine that when sitting down to plan a new arc, he gets flooded with visions of characters. Rather than cutting them down, he must deliberately go out of his way to try and work them all in because a man with the ability to become a jacket is so stupid that it needs to exist. When this sort of creative self-indulgence is taken to the extreme, you end up with arcs that are massively overstuffed, leading to a lot of time being taken away from the core themes that are intended. Not only that, but sometimes there are some genuinely interesting concepts that don't go anywhere significant because there's no room for them outside of a couple appearances, such as the Yeti Cool brothers. So throughout this whole video, I've been talking about how One Piece has too much stuff, for lack of a better term, and I've been highlighting how that is a major detriment to the manga. I haven't even really brought up the anime, which is a whole other can of worms of its own. However, earlier I mentioned that I actually think that this is simultaneously the series' greatest strength. You might be wondering, how could something be both a weakness and a strength? Well, simply put, it's not always a weakness, and it's also the very quality that gives One Piece its heart and soul. As previously stated, spontaneity is Oda's bread and butter. Bizarre and extraneous content is something that's defined his work from the very beginning. It's his unique style of expression. With One Piece, he's in a very rare position for an artist, which is that he's essentially able to freely explore any idea that he wants. Because of how he's established his world and story as being practically limitless, there's nothing stopping him from following up an arc set in feudal Japan with an island of the future. Oda once described his intentions for the manga to be like a metaphorical amusement park, and I think he's done a fantastic job at realizing that. The story is literally a blank canvas for him to let his imagination run wild. When reading One Piece, you're not just reading a whimsical pirate adventure, you're quite literally looking at a snapshot of one man's entire scope of creativity across the years. If you know anything about the creative process, then you know that not everything is going to stick the landing. However, that's no reason not to see them all through. In fact, you can't truly tap into your artistic potential without embracing as many ideas as possible and allowing yourself to treat the process as a form of play. Unfortunately, this does mean you'll inevitably create some pretty lousy results. With One Piece, Oda simply isn't afraid of putting out content that might not be what his audience wants to see. He allows himself to have fun and to follow the sparks that excite him. This unabashedly raw style of storytelling is precisely the very thing that makes his work so special. It's what has led to him being able to explore some incredibly brilliant ideas as well. It's no wonder that his main character is someone that embodies freedom and expresses the culmination of that theme through the power of boundless imagination. So yeah, personally, I think that the thought of a guy with the ability to become a jacket is so stupid that it needs to exist. But regardless of how I feel about the way Oda writes his story, there's a good chance that you don't feel the same, and I can't really blame you. Maybe you're not a fan of indulging in everything he puts in the manga. Maybe you do appreciate those little things, but they're just not enough to take away from the downsides. The downsides can be a major pain to get through, especially when you have to deal with the pacing issues of the anime. So how exactly could this problem be fixed? Like I said before, arcs like Zou and Sabaody are great examples of Oda reining in his own impulses and strictly focusing on the main points he wants to address. So shouldn't he just simply take that approach with every arc? Well, the thing is that those arcs are able to be so short because their primary narrative purpose is to set up bigger arcs that follow. Also, I think that something would be lost from the One Piece experience if everything was trimmed down. There's something special about getting to see such a broad perspective of every island that the Straw Hats visit. This is an adventure story after all. There is, however, one arc that represents the perfect balance of everything that makes One Piece so great. An arc that showcases the pinnacle of Oda's preferred style of storytelling, fully polished and consistent. That arc, of course, is Egghead Island. I won't be getting into spoilers if you're anime only or if you're not caught up to the manga, so don't click off just yet if that's you. Most people would agree that this arc is one of the most entertaining in the entire story. Even reading week to week, there has never been a more satisfying experience. What's even better is that it's not just all flash and hype. It's emotional, it's deep, and it's packed with lore. Before this arc started, I would have said that One Piece's flaws are an ongoing issue that could potentially get even worse. But now it seems like Oda may have actually found a solution of his own. Egghead is a prime example of Oda committing nearly every sin that I've mentioned in this video, and yet it works. It manages to be the most unrestrained, chaotic, and impulsive storyline in One Piece while also being one of the most captivating. Part of that is no doubt thanks to major lore reveals and getting to see certain characters get a spotlight like we've never seen before. Still, Oda has managed to stay true to his own charm. There are strange creatures and concepts, disconnected B-plots, and even unnecessary action sequences. I think what makes all of this work so well in Egghead specifically is that Oda has apparently learned when enough is enough. He doesn't dwell too long in one place, and he's constantly shifting the focus. He's following all of his impulses but also managing to tie everything together. If One Piece is a snapshot of one man's entire creative journey, then I believe we're witnessing that man develop his artistry to its fullest potential within Egghead. Needless to say, that doesn't change the fact that we had to witness a lot of imperfections and mistakes along the way. There are certain arcs that will forever be hindered. It's for that very reason why I believe that new adaptations like the live action or the Wit Studio remake are not only a breath of fresh air, but also necessary for One Piece to be enjoyed by as many people as possible. It's unfortunate that some content will inevitably have to be cut, but there's no denying that the story will become much more digestible and in some cases more effective. At the end of the day, the original anime and manga will still exist. As long as the newer adaptations remain true to the spirit of One Piece, some trimming around the edges won't do any harm. Sometimes you have to pull out a couple weeds to help the whole garden grow. Overall, One Piece is an incredibly enjoyable adventure that thrives off of showing as much as it possibly can. Whether it's a character with a random unique ability like turning boogers into bombs or a giant dog on a sky island, almost every single arc is guaranteed to be filled to the brim with anything and everything that Oda can think of. There are plenty of storylines, fights, and interactions that don't really need to exist at all. Unfortunately, there's a lot of stuff that's hit or miss, and ultimately this leads to some arcs being doubled in length. For the most part, Oda manages to keep things light and entertaining, but there are dozens of examples where he clearly goes overboard. Naturally, this means that an already long story often feels even longer. It's not uncommon for readers to get burnt out or to lose interest. However, this exact issue is also a major contributor to One Piece's charming appeal. Despite the drawbacks, the rawness of Oda's unfiltered storytelling is something that should continue. That's not to say it can't be improved, and if you're not a fan of the ridiculous magnitude of content in this manga, that's completely understandable. But there are plenty of examples of this concept being executed beautifully, and Oda continues to improve on it to this day. There should definitely be alternative ways of experiencing the story though, and there's only so much that one pace can do to fix Toei's horrible pacing in recent years. Hopefully the live action and anime remakes go as far as possible because they are the perfect solution. They can ideally make the series much less intimidating and inviting to more people, while at the same time letting Oda do his thing. At the end of the day, One Piece is always going to be super long and it's always going to be a little overwhelming. But if you were to restrict it too much, then you would lose the very essence of what makes One Piece, well, One Piece. If you're still here, thank you for watching. Let me know down below what you thought of the video and if you agree or disagree with any of the points I made. If you enjoyed this one, consider showing your support by subscribing or even just dropping a like. There will also be some links at the end if you want to check out some other content that I've made. Though, that's all for now. See ya.